Join me on a journey of building a new community around ideas of local engagement to discuss solutions to our national dilemmas. From this place, we can tap into our purpose to ensure its preservation. Place, purpose, preservation. This is perspective. Hello, everybody. Today is a very special day because we have a guest from outside of Prosperity. We've had so many guests coming in from Prosperity because we've had so much leadership in statewide here, but we got somebody that is of national leadership coming to us from Charleston, South Carolina today, and also an old friend of mine that has been a compatriot in preservation for the past almost 20 years. Welcome to Prosperity, Joe McGill.
Welcome. Thank you for the invitation. You say outside. I'm kind of outside, but my wife,
Yes.
Valerian Mosey McGill, her mother lived here in Prosperity. She has since passed away. Yes, but she lived here in Prosperity.
Yeah, what was her family name?
That would have been the Chaplains. Chaplin. Yes.
Yes, that's right. So when was the first time you came to Prosperity then and discovered Prosperity?
It would have been with her, of course. We've been married since 91, so I guess right around 89, 90
Wow.
would have been my first time.
Wow.
Yes.
So we have a lot to talk about with your work with the Slave Dwelling Project, but I always on this is all about place, purpose, preservation, and everything's rooted in place. So, Joe, share your life of the place that you were born in and growing up. Where was that?
Kingstree, South Carolina, Williamsburg County. Born in 1961, spent most of my life there. Grew up there. My school was integrated there right around the 4th or 5th grade of integration there in Kingstree, South Carolina. Going through all of that.
4th grade. That was me too, because I was in 61 also.
Yes. I learned a lot in Kingstree, South Carolina. What I think I learned more about Kingstree when I left, when I went away. It made me realize that there is another world out there other than my small hometown of Kingstree. Kingstree, of course, is the county seat of Williamsburg County. Population of about 4,000 or 5,000 people, which kind of gives you the relevancy, the scope of that place. Not that big, but to me it was big enough. I lived out in the country. I worked a whole lot in tobacco fields. This
is part of the state, in the low part of the state, near, I guess it's part of the PD, or is it kind of south of the PD?
Yeah, it kind of skirts that area.
It kind of skirts the PD, but it's definitely a low country economic system down there that's different from the up country up here. So when you were growing up as a young boy, what was life like for you and your family and the economics of labor there when you were a young boy, and how did that influence your life?
Well, it didn't come from a family of money by no means. My father was worked part-time, well, partially. Part of his life at Baxter was the name of the manufacturing plant where he worked.
What they make?
They made medical equipment, rubber gloves and things of this nature. But for Kingstree, South Carolina, if you worked there, you were really doing well. And he worked there for a spell before he left there. After he left there, he was always a brick mason, laying bricks.
Oh, okay.
So every now and then when I could get an opportunity to work with him, I did. But I spent most of my time making most of my money in my youth working in tobacco fields. It was those tobacco fields and cropping tobacco that got me my first car. That and driving a school bus. Got my first car in 1971 Cutlass, and boy, when I got that car, man, that gave me some liberty that I didn't know existed, and it was just a beautiful time.
Wow. Well, so, what was did y'all, and the reason I ask this is because I really want to go into the economics, because here with me growing up, the white landowning farmers had black folks living on the farms as tenants. Did you grow up that way, or?
No, it was not that for me. The property that we lived on, my we owned it. We still do. That property is still in our possession, yeah, even today. So we were lucky in that in those regards. Now, I guess I would say we were land rich but cash poor. I mean,
Yeah.
literally cash poor. It just was not there. My parents lived from paycheck to paycheck, and it showed in our presence and our parents. But in that time, in that place, we were poor and didn't know it,
Yeah.
because most of the people living around me were pretty much of the same economic status. Some a little higher up on the chain than we were, some lower. But it was a time of learning, a time of knowing that if you wanted to do better, you could, and the possibilities were there to do better. What I also learned was that if you were ambitious, as I was, you had to get out of King Street
Yeah.
to exercise that, to let that that ambitious just flow, just let it take charge, and so that you could be what you wanted to be. And my little small town of King Street couldn't contain all of my desire.
Well, I understand that because I felt the same thing with Prosperity. When I was 18 or 19, getting ready to join the Navy, I said, Prosperity is a great place to be from, but not a great place to be when I was 18, Of course, fate put me moving back here twice, kept bringing me back. But so tell me about your family and what you knew about your family, your father, your grandfather. Was y'all's community centered around a church? What was that like?
Well, church was always a thing for me. My first encounter with religion was the Catholic faith. Because of the poverty that was going on in and around me. It was the Catholic Church that assisted us in obtaining some of the things that was necessary to survive. Some of the clothing that I would wear would be gotten through these opportunities given by the Catholic Church that I would attend. But aside from that, my parents were able to provide for me those other necessities in life. We got fed. Going to bed hungry was not a thing. I do recall, those hunger pains sometimes, but they were always overcome. My parents, my mother, my father were always there to provide those things. My mother was always a housewife, very seldom worked outside of the home. If she did work out of the home, it's in somebody's agricultural field, tobacco field, cotton field, whatever.
And that would be seasonal anyway, wasn't it?
Seasonal, yes, for her. There was a time there where she would go on a daily basis to care for my grandmom and my granddad. In an event that eventually fall to me, because I moved in with them when I was very young, right around the elementary, back into the elementary school, junior high school era of my life. I moved out of my parents' house and moved in with my grandparents, which was a great thing for me.
Yeah. Why was that?
It gave me more independence. It got me out of a home where I shared a room with my sisters. We shared separate beds, but the same room.
How many siblings were you?
2 younger brothers and 2 older sisters.
Gotcha.
So the opportunity to move away from there into my own bedroom,
Yeah,
with my grandparents and all the liberties that brought me, and the money that it brought, as far as getting an allowance every week, as long as I performed my chores that were requested of me to perform. And that also taught me that if you can make an honest living if you just follow the rules, and if you're good with the instructions that are given you, and you're capable of carrying it out. There's something good about this independence that brings, and that kind of put me in a position to be able to not be afraid to go into the Air Force, go into experience the unknown that this military service would thrust upon me, it made me more capable of handling that. All those experiences that I had in my my little hometown of King Street. Since I've graduated up until now, it's been some type of preservation, museum-related work that I've been doing, because I left the Park Service after 6 years and went to Penn Center, St. Helena Island. Worked there for 3 years.
Now, who was president of it then? Emory
It would
or
have been Emory Campbell,
Emory?
my boss Emory, which will another good subject person to interview.
Oh, Emory was one of my heroes, and I'm going to reach out to him, see if I can convince him to come up here. I'll drive down there and get him if I need to.
Yes, he's the man. He's still the man.
Yes, he is.
So yeah, I worked for him for 3 years at Penn Center, and I left there and went to Iowa to build a museum, and it still exists. That museum is still there, the African American Museum of Iowa.
So who ran that? Who were you working for when you went up there?
There's a nonprofit, and I was the executive director.
Oh, so they were applying. You sent out. You just saw the job offer and said, "Okay, time to move."
Yeah, and they chose me, so I went and I lived in Iowa for six winters.
That's how you measure time in Iowa.
6 winters, but it was nice. Here's an interesting thing about Iowa, though, that I learned. This is just basic facts. At that point, Iowa was the 5th whitest state in the nation. The population of African Americans in the state of Iowa was about 2%, but they were 25% of the prison population.
Wow!
So that was a reality to deal with. So anyway, I spent 5 winters there building that museum, and shortly after they burned the mortgage, it flooded. But it's still there. It still exists.
Good.
It's still, they had good insurance. It's still there.
So what was the museum centered around in Iowa?
African American history. In the whole state of Iowa. Iowa became a state in 1838, if I got the date right. And it was quite prominent in Underground Railroad activities. So yeah, there's some Black history worth having a museum in the state of Iowa. So that museum was built, and I left there and started working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation.
And that's where we met when you were there.
Yes, National Trust for Historic Preservation. They had a office in Charleston, South Carolina, and that's where I worked, out of that office in Charleston, South Carolina. And then from there, working specifically in the states of Louisiana and Alabama.
So at the time, the National Trust had a system of outreach that unfortunately they don't have anymore. And it was the head office was there, and y'all, John Hildreth always your boss down there?
Always. Lovely man.
Yes.
Yes.
And John, it was the whole southern section. It was a regional thing, right?
It was a regional thing. We had the southern states within our jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. Florida, Georgia, the states I worked in, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, of course, South Carolina, that were all a part of what we were responsible for. And we were like gatekeepers for everything preservation of buildings, mm-hmm. historic buildings. You know, everything that with the National Trust that would deal with, it had to flow through us, you know, those regional offices.
Well, there was a lot of outreach things. So when I came on as director of Preservation South Carolina in 2007, the National Trust had a executive director training for nonprofits, and so I went up to Washington and did that, and then I came down and met with John, and that's when I first met you there in 2007, and you were basically the program director for South Carolina. So anything that was going on, you were the guy I called. Here's this. Is there a grant for this? Can you come and meet us at something else? And
yes.
You were always there, man.
Yeah, that's how it worked. We were the gatekeepers. We were like the caseworkers.
Yeah.
For all those things, preservation that the National Trust would be doing in that particular state. That's how it worked.
Yeah. How'd you enjoy that?
Oh, it was lovely. It was great. It was it gave me that opportunity to do those things that I always like to do travel, travel to those particular states. But above and beyond traveling to those particular states, those opportunities that came nationally associated with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, those yearly conferences that they would put on,
Which they did at different cities all around, which were so awesome, especially when we had the Partners Program going.
Oh, yeah, yeah. In fact, I was also a part of the diversity program that was there in the state. So because I was part of the diversity program that was being put on, I got to evaluate these folks who wanted to come to the National Trust Conference, and the National Trust effort was to make the trust more diverse, and this program helped to do that. So I was over that diversity program, and I met a lot of people through that diversity program. And again, going from these different historic cities was a great experience also. It helped me to build a network that would come in use later with this current thing that I do, the Slave Dwelling Project.
Right. So when did you see a sunset on the National Trust, or was it basically a top-down policy change and you realized, I got to find something else?
Well,
because the National Trust went through a lot of changes after Dick Moe left, and a whole lot of revision in their systems happened.
Yeah. They went through a process there where they were strategically planning and finding themselves adjusting to the current world. Preservation has been a thing for a while. It's a thing now, and it will always be a thing, because buildings turn 50-year-old every day. Every day there's some building turning 50 years old. So there's always going to be that need for preservation, need to preserve these buildings, because we don't want all these buildings to end up in a landfill. Although some of the modern ones that they're building, they kind of building in that sense, knowing that they're not going to last forever. And you get these big boxes or these major companies that'll move out of a building, and just to know that they're going to tear it down, or when you tear these buildings down, it's going to end up in a landfill somewhere. So there's all that. So I think preservation is always a good thing, because you have embodied energy and all that. And when we think about preservation in the sense of African American history, we got to think about the fact that if it's an antebellum building, chances are there's slave labor involved in some way, shape, or form. Either their labor was stolen to make that building possible, or they physically built it. They weren't the architects, but they physically built it. That's why I urge folks today, when they go into nice, beautiful, historic buildings built prior to the Civil War, if you see those marks in those beams, think about who put those marks in those beams, in slave labor. If you see those bricks with handprints, fingerprints in them, think about who put those fingerprints there, usually an enslaved person. So I try to encourage folks to look at buildings differently when they're trying to interpret the African American presence in these antebellum buildings.
So share with me, and let's talk about your consciousness of enslavement, on its impact on you and your family, and how you started feeling a sense of advocacy for that. Because the window that I saw an advocacy of the building itself, because we know, be it when I ran Preservation South Carolina, you see these little tiny wooden boxes seen not as important as the big house with the columns.
Yeah.
When it was without those little boxes, it wouldn't have been a big house with the columns. But your own personal consciousness of what that meant to you personally, your family, and how that elevated itself into advocacy.
Yeah. Well, as far as
growing up in King Street, what you felt.
Well, growing up in King Street, getting into preservation helped me connect some of the dots that I knew back then didn't know needed to be connected. Looking back, hindsight, why was the African American population, less capable of economic wealth than the white community that existed in that very small space in King Street that I existed? Why was all the wealth more in the corner of the white folks and less attributed to black folks? Well, with the current knowledge that I have since obtained, you got to connect those dots, and you got to connect those dots of this King Street, Williamsburg County, was historically an agricultural. The economics of that place started out as agricultural. That's where people were making their money through the antebellum crops that were being raised in that particular area.
Now, you said tobacco was cotton also as much?
Well, if you look at it historically, as the founding of Williamsburg County, cotton would have been more of a thing in that period in our history. But the point here is the opportunity for those cotton plantations to build wealth also takes away the opportunity for those being enslaved to build wealth. They can't do the same.
Right.
So generationally, you're enabling the planters to build more wealth, whereas you're still taking the opportunity to even start that process for the people who are being enslaved. So now you come to 1865, and it could be in Williamsburg County or anywhere. You are now in a place where the formerly enslaved people are now free. Yes, free, yes. But you got to also explore those things that continue to disenfranchise them, like the KKK and lynchings and convict labor and redlining and poll taxes and Jim Crow laws and black codes and disenfranchisements and massacres. So all those things are going on in King Street, just as they're going on everywhere. So it was not until I could kind of pull myself out and look back and kind of figure out why that generational wealth, that wealth gap existed. So now I understand. I understand more because I'm a historian, because I'm a preservationist. I understand more that this situation that we find ourselves now in this wealth gap is nothing that happened in our lifetime. It has a history.
Right. So when you talk about the families, we have a mutual friend, Yancey McGill, who was senator from there. Did you grow up knowing them and ever question why is my name the same as their name? Because the McGills were one of the wealthy collected families in King Street.
No, I never tried to connect those dots.
No.
Never did. And I think if I connect those dots, we can finally we may find out that we are connected because some of their ancestors on my ancestors, or it might go deeper than that. We might find a DNA connection too.
Yeah,
I haven't explored that. Somebody did some research for me and took my DNA, my family tree back to 1842.
Ooh, that's early.
Yeah, I was impressed by the research that what she found. But now it's going to take another researcher, not me, to take that information and take it back further.
Gotcha. Yeah, you can just, there you go, turn it out. That's fine. Fascinating. So, when you were when did it start coming to your heart and your thoughts, slave dwellings are vulnerable, I can elevate this?
Yeah. So I was a Civil War reenactor, still am, but more so right around the time I became a park ranger at Fort Sumter. I would encounter Civil War reenactors for the Confederacy, and they would they asked, well, do you want to join us? I said, why would I want to join you? Because you represent a part of history that enslaved my ancestors. Why would I want to join you? And then I saw the movie Glory was about to come out, and I said, look, wait a minute. I didn't learn this. This is based on a true story. Why don't I know this? Then I started doing this research, and found out that, wow, black folks were a part of the Union Army during the Civil War. So I started a reenactment group, just based on that.
And you do that from your work in Fort Sumter inspired you to really try to elevate that story,
connect those dots, elevate that story. So I started that reenactment group. Then I started working for the National Trust. And I saw that these slave dwellings do exist, but nobody's talking about them in a manner that they should be talking about. There's places that don't even acknowledge these places exist. In fact, they're places that people can visit. They're presidential sites that people can visit. Mount Vernon, Mount Pelier, Monticello, the Hermitage. And then I started this project. I said, well, why didn't they call these places plantation? Because they all are. I said, well, that's it. There's always been that effort to minimize slavery or not talk about slavery or make it palatable.
And make the history palatable without elevating the negative pain.
Right. That's why you don't visit Mount Vernon Plantation or Monticello Plantation or Montpelier Plantation or the Hermitage Plantation. There was that effort even then when these places came online to hide that element, that part of their history. So there's something to that. So the thing that really I think made me realize that the fact that this slave dwelling project that I do needed to exist was when I was a part of a team of people who were evaluating the work that was being done at the place that I'm currently employed. I work at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens in Charleston, South Carolina. So they were restoring those cabins, and they brought in a team of experts to evaluate the work. And I was part of that team, and I said out loud, I said, man, this is nice. I said, when these buildings are finished, I would like to spend the night in one of them. I said it out loud. Somebody amongst us heard it. They took it up the chain of command. They thought it was a great idea. I acquired a list from the State Historic Preservation Office, Elizabeth Johnson.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, so it was easy. It was an easy sell for her because we were like-minded people like you, preservationists. Yeah, I like your idea. Here's a list.
Wow, what they knew existed either through the National Register or something. So let's go back to the Magnolia, because those slave dwellings being restored were so wonderful in that, and we gave it, with Preservation South Carolina, gave it a Preservation Honor Award for the work. But what made it so important was they showed the trajectory from enslavement time and showed how these houses were adopted by people that lived in them later as free labor on the place, right? And the thing that really impressed me was the newspaper wallpaper inside, because I grew up here with that in the houses where they would use the newspaper or cardboard.
Insulation. Yeah, those
all that was restored.
And as you just stated, they not only froze the time of slavery, but beyond, as you just stated, people continued to live in these houses beyond slavery as paid labor. But because they continued to live in these houses up until 1990, we have 4 cabins there that we interpret. The first one is restored to look like the year 1850. The second one is 1920, 1969, and then we go back, we go in reverse to 1870. So that we tell those stories at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, and I get to do that Monday through Friday when I'm not traveling to other places to do the same thing. So I get to do that Monday through Friday at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens.
And I did that, and I would encourage anybody listening to that, if you're taking a trip to Charleston, to go down and listen to Joe's presentation, because it's amazing, because it really shows the black experience, not just under a glass of everything's about enslavement. It's about what happened with freedom, what happened, how they adapted, how they were still, some of these people still trapped in an economic system, but they made what they could out of the places where they lived. It's fascinating. And it really shows that they're better than any place in the country.
Yeah. So come on out to Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, preferably when I'm working.
Yes.
But anytime, come on out to Magnolia Plantation and Gardens.
Yeah. So then you started picking places. So tell me about when you told me you were doing this, at the same time, Preservation South Carolina had just discovered what I believed were slave dwellings in Anderson, South Carolina. These 3 little 2-room houses that had been turned into a slumlord's rental properties. And they were about to be sold, and we stepped in and we got the slumlord to, I think we had to buy them from them. And we were able to buy them, and then we wanted to figure out what to do. So that's about the time you started.
Oh yeah. And Michael Beatonbaugh is one of the ones that, as I went down this list and I was going down this list, just calling these sites to request permission to spend the night in their slave dwellings. Michael was one of the ones who called me, and because he called me, that made me know that what I was doing had relevance, because now I'm not looking at this list of places that was provided to me by the State Historic Preservation Office. Now I'm getting these phone calls from these folks because, once my very first sleepover in a slave dwelling was at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. Mm-hmm. My second one was at the Hayward House in Bluffton, South Carolina. My third was at McLeod Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. But then I started getting these phone calls. One was from Goodwill Plantation in Eastover. Mm-hmm. And that was a private owner. This gentleman, Mr. Larry Falconberry, had acquired the land, and his intent was to develop it. But then he went to the land and fell in love with it and started doing the research on this plantation, and the research turned out that this was one of the places inland, probably the furthest inland where they grew cotton. The fact that these enslaved people came over to this place because of the Civil War, and these owners of these enslaved people didn't want them to be near where federal forces could be. So they moved them from there, and Goodwill Plantation was one of the places that they moved it to. But the point is, just as Mr. Larry Falconberry was one to call me, so was Mike Beatonbaugh. He called me, and he told me about this place that he wanted me to spend the night in Anderson. At that point, Anderson was nowhere on my radar as a place that I thought would have a slave dwelling. And Michael Beatonbaugh, he made me aware of these buildings that he had, and it got onto the list. And sure enough, we went there and we spent the night there. Terry James, a good friend of mine, who's a former board member of the Slave Dwelling Project, joined me that night for his very first sleepover.
Yes, I know, and it was such an amazing moment for me personally, because it really put a certain power to place. Because place is more than just geography. Place is culture. Place is human emotion. All of those things, and it's the root. It's the wellspring of that. And these places that had been neglected and turned, I was so happy that all this came together. The Anderson County Historic Group came in and did a cleaning them out, and we had a young filmmaker come and do a video, which we'll put the link of This Place Matters, which was wonderful, about 15 minutes long, but we'll put it in here when that was done, where we were all interviewed for it. But I have to tell you, one of the things I want to talk about is this book that just has been written about experiencing Joe's sleeping with the ancestors, and it documents all his work there. And when the Herb Frazier, who helped put this together, called me to get correct it and get the details, especially of the sleepover. Oh my gosh, I felt terrible because I didn't realize how Terry was concerned with me not spending the night. I had no idea, because I remember Terry coming to me and said, "You're not going to spend the night." And Joe, you've asked me several times to do it, and I chose not to on those certain times just because, one, I didn't want it to seem like I was just posing just to say, "Look at me, I'm a white guy trying to be in touch with my black friends." I mean, it didn't seem like my story, and it didn't seem something that would project in a way. And with that, but that was honestly secondary. The other thing is, I hated camping out.
Well,
but all of that I read. And I felt so bad, Terry. I'm so sorry, man. Wow, he was truly concerned about being up there alone without a white man to be there to make sure to block.
yeah.
And I'm so sorry about that. I didn't realize that energy was there.
Well, that's okay. That's okay, because I don't know if I was at the point in this project yet where I was ready to ask a white person to spend the night in those spaces with me.
When you went into it, was it more an own personal exploration of emotional learning and not thinking of a big nonprofit that would be communicating more?
It was anger. It was anger because my education, my limited education, Kingstree, South Carolina, it left me in a bad place. It left me in a place where my enslaved ancestors were happy to be enslaved, and the people who enslaved them were good to them. That's where my limited education left me. Even going to South Carolina State University, it didn't change that. My time in the military didn't counter any of that. And because I had this built up anger through learning, being lied to is a better way to put it. And working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and knowing that the places existed and the potential was there to do more with these places. All these things came together. I often tell people there's two things that you could do with anger. You could use it for good, or you could use it for evil. I think evil is going into a place with an assault rifle and taking people out for some crazy stuff that's in your head, or going into a church and taking out 9 lives for some crazy history that's in your head. I think good is more of the John Lewis type, make noise, make good noise.
Well, it's about elevating loving intention.
Yes.
That's where it is. And what is the energy behind the intention? Is it to project love and faith, or to ingest protection and fear?
Mine is about love and faith. And it's about telling the stories of those enslaved people who, while on this earth, their voice were taken away from them. They were muted. And they were muted in the sense that it became illegal for them to be educated. And if it's illegal for them to be educated, therefore they cannot leave those stories, those documentations, those things that tell their stories about their lives. And it was the victors that wrote their stories, and they wrote their stories in a sense that had me in that place of my education that was that bad place I didn't want to be. I didn't want to remain there. I wanted to know that our people were more than what they said they were. And this journey has taught me that they were.
Well, we're the same age, so in the probably 3rd grade when I had it, we had our South Carolina history by Mary Sims Oliphant, right? And I have the copy of the book I had. And I remember sitting there in the third grade and reading this wonderful story about the children visiting her grandmother and going to all the different places. And it showed all these great areas of the state. And I went into the book recently, and I just went in to see the first image of a black person in the book. Well, Jim was the helper that helped their grandmother, and he's running a wagon so they can ride in it. But the first real picture shows a young black boy, about 10 or 11, sitting down with a watermelon in his mouth. 2/3 of the way in. Yeah. So there you cannot read the history in the early 60s of South Carolina, the history book taught to the children, without seeing it skewed in a way to make everything just seem, that was something in our Southern history that's all rooted in the war, rooted in the tragedy of the war, rooted in the fear of conflict, where, we just don't talk about those things.
When I first started sleeping in slave dwellings 13 years ago, I would go to these sites, and the first thing that the site managers wanted to show me was the big house. And I resisted. I said, no, I'm not here for that. I want to highlight this slave dwelling. Well, I had to back off that way of thinking because what I was missing was that opportunity to interpret spatial segregation inside those nice, beautiful big houses. So I started going into those nice, beautiful big houses so that I can interpret that spatial segregation. So if you take notice of these nice, beautiful antebellum houses, there's always a front door, a grand entrance. You go in that front door, that grand entrance, you'll see the nice, beautiful staircase that gives you access to the upper levels of the building. Well, what I tell folks is to always look for those second set of stairs. It's the second set of stairs in those places that gave the enslaved people access. And you can see the discrimination or prejudice, if you will, designed into these buildings. Now, if you fast forward, if you come forward in history, you can interpret them as blacks going up to the balcony in the movie theater, looking at the movie from there. You can also interpret it as a sign: black bathroom, white water fountain, black water fountain. Sometimes it's just a velvet rope separating the people. That train station, black waiting room, white waiting room. All that was in there. But if you go back to the antebellum period, you can interpret the same thing in those stairs. The nice grand staircase, and then there's that second set of stairs. And that second set of stairs in these antebellum houses aren't as elaborate.
They're utilitarian. They're just a little closet, open the door, it's a little tiny narrow stairs up through the back.
And imagine this. Imagine trying to negotiate those stairs with a full chamber pot and having an accident, slippage. Not only are you going to suffer the consequences of getting that stuff all over you, but now you got to suffer the consequences of the enslavers dealing with you, the person who made that infraction.
Wasn't paying attention, wasn't watching your work.
There you go. So now I go in all these places where they invite me to, and I try to help them reimagine their interpretation through, hey, yeah, let's talk about all this nice grandness, but then let's go to this step here and talk about all that happened here.
Well, I tell you, your work with the slave dwelling, whatever reasons in starting in your own sense of realization and exploration of yourself and your personal history and how you interpret the history that was taught to you, you've made a huge difference in the country, because ever since you started this, you've been on NPR and all these interviews. Everybody that has these antebellum museum houses are now starting to do that, aren't they? They're really they're going out of their way to really show that they're communicating. Yeah, aren't they?
Even if it's something simple as interpreting those axe marks in those beams are looking for those fingerprints in the bricks. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, we just, in real estate, I just finished selling helping folks buy the bowling house, which is a house built in the 1840s. And sure enough, I went onto the side. I was able to show them the little child's fingerprints in the bricks on the side of that place. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the stories that highlight to you when you're sitting here, the experiences that you had? What are some of the things that you've taken away and go, wow, that was an amazing moment?
I think the most memorable moment, even let's go back even before the Slave Dwelling Project existed, and I'm give you my epiphany as for loving spaces. I think that came back to the military when I went to I went to Amsterdam, mm-hmm. and I went into the space where Anne Frank hid from the Germans, and that did something to me. That took me back to that time in that history class in high school where I was supposed to be giving my school teacher my full attention. Mm-hmm. I wasn't. But being in that space made me realize, oh, this is what that day in class, this is what they were talking about. Now I'm in the space. Now it's relevant. So again, that was my epiphany. Now there was no, I wasn't in that space, and then I thought forward, the slave dog. No, it wasn't that at all. But it planted that seed that would lay dormant until I was on that team of researchers evaluating the preservation work that was being done to those slave cabins. I said, well, wait a minute. There's something. These spaces need more attention than what they're giving. So that helped me, that helped me get back to that space. But a memorable moment along this journey. It was back to Texas, Brenham, Texas, Seward Plantation, where I stood on an authentic auction block. And standing on this authentic auction block made me realize that, whoa, historically, if I'm standing on this block, then I got to bear my back to the potential buyer to show that potential buyer that there is no marks on my back, because that's an indication of me being whipped, which means I'm a defiant person, which means to that potential buyer, no, I don't want him. I don't want to deal with him. I don't need to buy him, insert him into amongst my already docile and broken people, and to give them ideas of being defiant or wanting to escape. So that's the most memorable moment.
You talked about your childhood, but you didn't really talk about any awareness of the residual aspect of Jim Crow, of segregation. How did that affect you as a child? Were you aware of it then, or were you more aware of it later, looking back, going, "Oh, that's why they were doing that"? What was that like for you?
Yeah, I had to move away, because as a young child, it's not in my face. It was not in my face. For various reasons. We didn't have the means to travel. That was just not a part of what we did. Not in my family. My little world was in my community, my school. I did very little traveling beyond Williamsburg County. Now, because of going back to being in the Catholic faith and them providing some of those things that are necessary in life, we would go maybe once a year to Huntington Beach. Mm-hmm. It's in Huntington or Hunting. The one there's the closest to Myrtle Beach. Huntington. We would go there yearly on a field. We looked forward to that, and that was one of those rare occasions that I would get out of Williamsburg County. So my point is, I was not really faced with those things. I don't ever remember going into the city of Kingstree and not being able to go have access to all those places. I always. There
was never somebody saying there, step off the sidewalk, or that didn't. You weren't aware of that?
No, I wasn't. That did not happen to me now. But moving away, here's what I noticed. Why was it that Thursday was the day that black folks went to the county fair? Now, none of that was written. But Thursday was the day that black folks went to the county fair. But it took me moving away and looking back and connecting those dots to figure it out. Yeah, that was one of those discriminatory practices.
But it was so embedded that you as a young boy, it wasn't even noticed.
Right. And there was nobody in my realm trying to get to the library or anything of that nature. So I never experienced those things. And here's what I've noticed. I've noticed that I'm of that age, I'm 61, that I guess I was kind of on the tail end of things. As I said, fourth, fifth grade, my school was integrated. So we've always had kind of interaction from that point on, more interaction from that point on in my life with white folks, growing up in Williamsburg County and being a part of the public school system. Now,
was there any problems with interacting with, because when you integrate, all of a sudden you had all these white kids in the class with you. Was there any?
Well, we were at an age, fourth, fifth grades, that those kind of things didn't bother us. All we saw was another person, and an opportunity to interact with other people. Now, there were grades higher up where those kind of attitudes were more prevalent and more combative, but not at the age that we integrated. It was, let's do this. Hey, where you're a person, you're a human, I'm a human. Let's hang out. Let's hang out.
Well, I'd love to share with you from the other side of it, from what I experienced here. I shared with this on some of the other interviews, but my life growing up was basically very common with a white oligarchical family. We were the landowners. My grandfather sold mules here. There were some of the leaders in the community. And on our farm were two households filled with black folks that had been there for 2 generations. They were sharecropping for my grandfather. And one of these women were one of the women that walked a half a mile to my house every day and cooked and took care of us, Florence. And they were living in a house that was not a house, but it was the old schoolhouse. So my grandfather gave that schoolhouse to them to live in. And they had a hand pump well and they had an outhouse. And they had that up until I was 9 years old. So that was my consciousness of normal. Was I'd sit in my 1960 brand new ranch house, and Florence would walk from her little wooden home with a hand pump and walk up and cook in our kitchen and clean and fuss at me when I let my dog inside and poop into the kitchen, and I could still hear her hollering and taking a broom and kicking that dog out and all of those things. And I'd get excited to walk back with her because it was so exciting for me to pump that well for her, right? So here's this little white kid with all the hot water and spigot, and I had no consciousness of it. And I always think about what was going through Florence's mind when I say, Florence, let me pump your water for you. And I just love pumping that well for her. And she'd sit there and pump, or I go out and chase chickens because she had her chickens. And that was so normal for me. I can still remember being out in the backyard and looking for Florence, and she hollered, baby, I'm over here. And she opened up the outhouse door. She's sitting there in the outhouse. And I remember still talking with her. But then they moved to another place. Dad, Uncle Earl gave them an acre, and they got a government-subsidized home. But it was until then that I really had a consciousness of black folks that I grew up with that had something more than an outhouse. Mm-hmm. There were folks living nearby that, you drive by and you see toilet paper all out in the woods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was so normal and normalized. And when I went to Dr. Mills, the first time I ever experienced seeing Florence outside of that environment, I went to Dr. Mills. He had a big waiting room, and they had a big thing saying, come on, who's next to see the doctor? So, so I went in with my mom. I was feeling sick, and I looked through the back door, through another door, and there was Florence in a chair in another part of the clinic. I went, Florence, what are you doing here? And I started going over there to her, and somebody said, oh, honey, you need to stay over here. And she said, that's all right, baby. Yeah, and so it fascinates me now in looking back how normalized all this was. And it feeds my sense of when I have very good friends who sometimes communicate things that they don't understand those complexities and those damages, because the only history book of South Carolina they read was the one that we read when we were in the 3rd grade.
Yeah, yeah. Which kind of normalized it all.
Well, it did.
Made it more simple for them to accept and not be radical or try to change it, or just be comfortable in the privileges that afforded them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it was that also sense of what's proper to talk about. When we talk about place and elevating place, we grew up in a world where we also heard, know your place.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Definitely.
Yeah. And so
the word uppity,
Yeah. Well, that was the counter, but that whole way place was weaponized, right? When Robin Waits and I were working with a group in trying to save a house. It was an 1850s house in Columbia, and it was near the Washington Street district, which was all the Jim Crow black commercial district of Columbia. During Jim Crow, of course, you had black commercial areas. And it was a pretty prosperous area, considering it was businesses owned. But then after Jim Crow, that was the first area, because most of these were kind of substandard buildings, right? That was the first area to be urban redevelopment. And urban renewal. And so most of those places were gone, destroyed. This house was the last remnant, but it was an 1850s house. And we were standing there. We had members of the community in there. I talked about this with Kimberly, but it needs to be said again. There were members of the community in there, and we were sitting here, and this is where you're really embedded in your own experience. You don't really understand what's on the other side of the experience. And we're just all, yes, and this is why it's so good, and this is why it's so. And there was this elderly black gentleman sitting over on the corner, not saying a word. And he finally stood up and said, "What makes you think we want to remember this mess?"
Mm-hmm.
And that whole concept just hit me like a ton of brick. Now, my response was, I didn't have any response then. My response in talking to Robin and everybody later was, they said, well, he's absolutely right. I said, well, yeah, because that's his personal experience, but that doesn't mean we still don't need to protect it. I mean, we need to be able to tell the story. That had a personal pain body with him he didn't want to personally do. That needs to be remembered too, right? That whole story, which is why I tell it all the time. But that's part of it.
I had a situation in this journey with the Slave Dwelling Project, Lynchburg, Virginia. It's a museum that we went to, and at some point in its history, originally it was, of course, the big house for a big landowner and enslaved people there. Well, at some point, as it's transitioned, it became a community center. So we're there. I got some living historians with me, and people are coming there and they're interacting with us. And most of the white folks that I encounter, they're talking about how they remember the buildings as a recreation center. Well, the black folks are just the opposite. They remember on the other side of the fence not being able to come and access all the things that this community center let the white folks have access to. So that was that situation kind of it played itself out everywhere. And as I travel around and to these different places, I come upon a lot of situations like that. In fact, also in this journey, going from place to place and sleeping in these places, when I go there to these sites and we put on programs because of my presence there, I always query the audience, because if it's a diverse audience, I always ask, how many of you are visiting this place for the first time? And most of the black folks will raise their hands, because once upon a time in the existence of this place where I'm at right now, there was no desire for black folks to go there, and for various reasons, because of what we just talked about, the discrimination at that space that may have existed in the lifetime of the people that are sitting there right now. Or, there's also, that time, once upon a time, the National Park Service did a study years back. They wanted to know why black people weren't as abundant in their audiences. Well, one of the reasons is because, that site itself, that National Park Service, I think they came around to the realization that they should give black folks access a lot sooner than some of these more private type places to visit, or state-owned or county-owned places to visit. But even if those national parks always gave black folks the opportunity to visit these places, they still had to get there, and getting from point A to point B is not always easy for black folks. That's why the Green Book was a part of our lives.
So real quick, the Green Book was a publication made by a Mr. Green, right? That basically during segregation, they would put out this book to tell folks, black folks that were up north, wanted to travel to visit relatives after the diaspora, they want to come back down. Here's the places that are safe. Here's the hotels that will let you in. Here's the restaurants that will feed you in the segregation of the South.
Exactly. So so that's another reason. A lot of these folks who had to deal with that are still alive. That's why, and these folks who experience these things aren't going to encourage their children to be a part of what you offer because of what they experienced. The same thing that applies to that older black gentleman that made that statement.
Yeah, that pain, that memory is still there. So when people sit here and talk about, that was so long ago, it wasn't.
It wasn't. And I got to tell you about this other story. So my daughter is, she graduates from Clemson University.
It's wonderful. I saw the pictures and everything.
But when she was at Clemson, her undergrad was at Clemson University. So she's at Clemson University. I'm proud of my daughter. I'm wearing this hat, Clemson University. So I'm in the drugstore, and this elderly black gentleman was looking at me, look at my hat. He said, and I'm proud.
Now, where were you when you were doing this?
Drugstore near my home in Ladson.
Okay.
So he looks at my hat and he says, "Man, I'm glad you're proud of that, but I applied to Clemson and they denied me because I was black." And this he was a retired medical doctor. Retired medical doctor.
So he was like maybe 20 years older than you were, 10 years?
You had to have that somewhere around there. And he told me about his applying to Clemson University and being rejected because he was black. So for him, that hat was painful to look at. But it kind of goes back to that black gentleman sitting in the corner.
Well, and that's why I was really looking forward to having you talk about all of this so we can really discuss this, because the big thing that so many people miss is the perspectives are from people who had totally different places than what they could see. So the big symbol I have on my perspective channel is you've heard about the parable of the elephant and the blind man? So the parable of the elephant is South Asian. And it's the old story where these blind men, wise men, were tasked to describe what an elephant is. So one blind man only touched the leg. One blind man touched the tail. One touched the trunk. So each one came back. Well, an elephant's like a giant snake, or it's like a sword. And they went to blows over it. And that is a lot of what we're dealing with now in the country. I think because of lack of civic leadership and civic education, there's a lot of blind people in this country right now constantly empowered by only what they see and the bubbles that they're in. And it's absolutely amazing. And it's frustrating because that goes into the part of what is woke versus what is awakened, right? Woke has been weaponized because it's easier to weaponize a bumper sticker then the concept of awakened, of waking up and actually realizing there's a problem with the history book that the first image of a smiling black person is a boy eating a watermelon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, I mean, what all does that mean?
Yeah. Yeah. We're living in a time right now where history it's always been important, but it's even more important now because it's being weaponized in a sense that they say that teaching the real history makes kids hate themselves or hate America.
And what amazes me, what's fascinating is folks who sit there and say, well, this does not represent racism. And if you think it does, you don't know your history, which is a fascinating thing. And it's it's like the blind guy holding the leg of the elephant, thinking he knows what the other blind people are feeling or seeing or understanding or whatever's in their realm. Because at 16, we had a mayor in Whitmire, South Carolina, northern part of the county. Let's just say he had sympathies toward the Klan, right? Now, this is in the 70s when the Klan was losing a lot of its power in the rural areas. Here, there was still a lot in others, but here in Newberry County, I can hear my grandmother, them talking about the negative aspects of it all and how dark it was. But anyway, they had a Klan rally. So me and my 16-year-old friends were like, let's just go up and see what it's about, you know, just to see whatever's going to happen. So it was more highway patrolmen on the road than it was anybody else. And the rally was nothing more than maybe 20 or 30 people sitting there, and they did their little celebration thing. They had their Confederate flags flying. And, you know, I walked away going, these people are a joke. But what it was able to do was to give me an ability to tell anybody that wants to take the Confederate battle flag and say it has other meanings than what they think it does. I say, well, how many of you were at the Klan rally telling the Klan they were wrong? Right? Mm-hmm. How many of you were there doing that? I never saw them there doing that or even talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And see, that was part of the problem in trying to convince folks that it was about heritage and not hate. And it's exactly what you said. You know, tell them.
Tell them. Yeah. I mean, I grew up with it being taught about heritage because I had a ancestor, Jacob Warner. I have named my son after him. That was in the war. He was killed at the Battle of Petersburg in the last month of the war, died with a bayonet wound to the groin, took 3 days to die on a gurney. You know, this whole horrible experience that these people went through in that conflict. And that's where that heritage aspect that was taught to us, you know, and why I had a rebel flag belt buckle when I was in high school, because that's what it was. It was about that. But then when you realize how it is being used, how it is being weaponized, so I'm sure you've had some interesting conversations sitting at Magnolia when you have all these tourists there. What is that like? What have you heard? How do you navigate some of these? Because it is a learning thing.
Yeah. Well, you know, the number one question that I get at Magnolia, working there as a tour guide and telling them about the slavery that existed at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, after I stand there and talk to them for about 10 minutes about the horrors of slavery, the number one question that I still get is, were the Draytons good slave owners? And the owners of the plantation are the Draytons. They've been owning the place. It's been a family business since 1679.
Same
family still owns the place. And the number one question is, were the Draytons good slave owners? Now, that does not come from young folks. It comes from mostly older folks, my age and older, or sometimes a little younger. which is an indication to me that these people that asked the question were educated the same way I was educated. To even let those words protrude from their lips, or let that question protrude from their lips. The younger folks, what they want to know is, well, what are the Draytons doing to make it right? They center their questions around this reparations thing. But back to that number one question that I get, it's because they were educated in the manner that I did. Now, they don't like the answer that I give them.
What's the answer you give them?
The answer that I give them is no, they were not good people. They were not good slave owners. And here are the reasons. You know, we know that at least 6 enslaved people escaped. We know that because the Draytons advertised to get them back. I don't know if they got them back or not. I really hope they didn't. We're going to have to assume that more than that escaped. The Draytons freed none, zero, zilch. The Draytons lived the lavish lives that they did at the expense of stolen labor. The houses that the enslaved people lived in were duplexes as opposed to the nice, beautiful big house that the Draytons lived in. Those families of enslaved people could be torn apart at any time. It depends on what the buyer wanted. If that buyer wants to buy one enslaved person, he wants to buy one enslaved person, not a whole family. And those enslavers were not going to stand in the way of a sale just to keep an enslaved family together. And the last one that really gets them is the fact that the last enslaver on that property was an Episcopal priest. That's the one that's hard for them to accept. But and here's the thing. If they ask me that question, that means every similar site that they go to, they ask the same question. They want to know if that particular slave owner was a good slave owner. And I'm sure that once upon a time, as these places were being interpreted, if you go to any of these sites 15, 20 years ago, I'm sure that person answering that question was going to tell them something that they wanted to hear, because that was the interpretation back then. Yes, they were good to their enslaved people. That's not for real. We are cleaning that up. We are cleaning that aspect of the interpretation up. And I think the Slave Dwelling Project can take some of the credit for that.
Yeah, it definitely can. It definitely can. So I have several experiences I want to share with you. One, and it shows, it kind of betrays a lot of different complexities that happen in the society of an oligarchical slaveholding society. And one of those is a man named Jacob Beatonbaugh. So as a young boy, I grew up, and I remember walking down Main Street with my dad. We were going to the drugstore to get cherry cola or something, and here came a man walking down the street dressed really nice, and he was he had kind of straightish hair, but he was darker complexioned than any of us, and I, at the time, I was really into Indians, and I thought I thought he was an Indian, right? Because I'm telling Dad, and as he walked up to us, Dad said, "Hey, Clee, how you doing? Good to see you, David," and spoke to him. I mean, he had a hat. He was dressed to the nines. And as I left, I said, "Dad, is he an Indian?" He goes, "No, son. That's man's Clee Beatonbaugh. Let me tell you about him. It said his daddy was part of 3 brothers that made a bet they were going to go down to Charleston and buy them a wife, an enslaved person to be their wife. And 2 of them chickened out, and his father did that. And they had children. And where Clee lives, and he showed the house later where it was. And so that was this interesting story that I was told. And then I'm in high school, and I'm in school with Ava Beatonbaugh, who has who was there in our classes, and I found out she's kin to Clee. I said, "Oh, we're cousins," because we're both Beatonbaughs. Because I looked up genealogy of Jacob, and I realized, and she said, "No, we're not cousins. We're cousins, yeah." And so it was kind of a fun little thing. Well, Come to find out, we were then invited by some folks who wanted to have the Jacob Beatonbaugh reunion at AME Church, and I was approached by some folks who wanted to know some of the genealogy. So here's the story of what happened beyond the story. I met some of the descendants of Jacob Beatonbaugh, and they didn't know the full story themselves. And it wasn't until that Preservation South Carolina was asked to put the building on the National Register. We put it on the National Register where Jacob Beatonbaugh has. And so here's the story. Jacob Beatonbaugh, this is in the 1850s, he took up a household with a woman named Sarah. Now, I haven't been able to do the deep research to see if he had purchased her or however he inherited. I don't know how he came to have her in his household in 1859, but by 1861, he started having children by her. Had 7 children. And they lived together in that house. He sent every one of those children to college. And under Tillman's new constitution, anti-misogyny, they were sued by Jacob Beatonbaugh's cousins. Sued him. They lost the suit. She had to live in the old kitchen house because the law said they could not be married. So legally, she had to live in the old, the old kitchen houses were separate. So they turned that into an apartment for her. That building still exists. The house still exists. And it is the only building on the National Register that is a representation of the anti-misogyny laws in South Carolina. And it's out there near Mid-Carolina Club, still there.
Wow.
Yeah. So what's really cool is the people that own it now, their sisters, Ojetta Rogerie Thompson is descended from them. They own the house. She was President Obama's appointment, and she got the appointment to the First Federal Circuit Court of Appeals in Rhode Island, and she's my 5th cousin.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, in fact, I'm hoping she will be on the podcast. She's coming down to visit in June. And I hope we can get the house saved. But it's a fascinating story of those sort of things. Second one, if you would indulge me, is of me realizing that my grandfather had sexual relations with daughters of the sharecroppers on the farm. And in the last 2 weeks of my father's life, he told me about it and told me about how he believed his daddy got these girls pregnant. Come to find out, I find out about others in my family that got girls pregnant. I had a great uncle that was in the Klan. I didn't know this until I was 30-something. And the other great uncle wanted to protect the family, and he got the family taken out and moved out of town into Columbia because the Klan had a rally that they're going to burn out the house. And they were run out of town. And my other great uncle took them and protected them. So I share all this because, one, anybody of my peer group, I see myself, and I tell this to my kids, I'm really one of the last people of my generation in this area, among all my friends, that had feet in both sides of the line of Jim Crow and the legacy of that, and then integration and what happened after that. And it's amazing what happens when you really listen to what folks are saying and try to bridge over that barrier that exists. When you were growing up, was there things you were told that here's what you don't say around white folks? Was there any part of that culture that you grew up with?
Well, no,
No.
because again, very limited resources, and the inability to expand my world beyond where my limited resources would take me. Now, every now and then there would be white folks coming to my house to conduct business, insurance man, or things of this nature. And as a young kid, you're curious, you're looking up into their faces, and your parents was telling them, go away, this is going folks' business, stuff like that. Um, there were those occasions, but again, beyond having to be disciplined as to what and what not do around white folks, it was never really a thing that had to be expressed to me. Unlike today, if you're a black parent, you got to have that conversation with your young children, especially your young black males. That if you get stopped by the policeman, blah blah blah. Luckily for me, I got a daughter who just graduated. She's a now veterinarian. She just graduated from Tuskegee University, and she's been just glorious all her life. And I didn't have to worry about some of the things that black folks have to worry about, especially they have sons in this world. So for me in King Street, being very limited, having very limited resources, and not having that opportunity vastly presented to me to interact with anyone beyond being in school, because they always had us in a place with the county fair. Thursday was our day. Most of the people at the county fair would look like me.
So there were certain institutional guardrails that had been in place generationally that people just flowed in a groove,
right,
without having to be reinforced.
Right. And now one of the things I'm researching now is because I'm a researcher and people tell me things, I come across information. Every day at noon, there used to be this whistle that would blow. And even living out in the country, 7 miles out of King Street, this whistle would blow at noon. So now I'm hearing that in some places, these whistles would blow to indicate that you're in a sundown town. If this whistle blows and you're still around, you need to get off. You need to get off the streets. And some people told me, they interpreted it as, there was this whistle that would blow to tell the black folks that white folks are coming to town. You need to vacate the area. But I'm still convinced that whistle would blow every day at noon, because it was that day at noon time to take a break. So I still want to stay with that thought process. I'm hoping I'm not going to find it otherwise. But you're getting back to your point. No, I was not confronted with it that way, and in a way that made me a person more capable and more receptive to these opportunities to interact more with folks. I come across black folks who are older than I am. I find out that they're much more militant in their ways of wanting to deal with discrimination and prejudice. We have a mutual friend. At least she's my friend, Janie Harriet. I know.
Oh yes.
I know her, and I know her well. I love her, and we try to achieve the same things in the end. Equal justice, but our methods are different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it has a lot to do with age and what she's been confronted with versus what I've been confronted with. And again, our methods are just different of achieving the same goals of equality.
Well, it almost takes two plows to plow the same field, doesn't it? Sometimes. I mean, it's everybody bringing their own perspective. And I tell you, and to Janie, I will always be thankful to Janie for helping me with Defusky. So one of the projects we had on Defusky Island was the Gullah Building revitalization program we were trying to do to develop a system to get granted money to restore probably what is one of the largest collections of original Gullah dwellings existing on a sea island in South Carolina, maybe in the whole Gullah Geechee corridor. It's an amazing place. And we developed this thing, but we had a lot of pushback from a certain group of people. One of them was Dr. Herman Blake. I mean, bless his heart, he came at us with all guns a-blazing on how we shouldn't be doing what we're doing. I thought he was terribly wrong and misguided in his anger toward us. And unfortunately, it really hurt the program with the influence he had with other people. But to Janie's credit, Janie, Michael Allen, and Love, Leon Love.
Yeah.
Leon Love, God rest his soul. What a great man he was. He's not with us anymore. But they went down to sit down and talk with Herman Blake on behalf of the program. And Janie called me afterwards and said, give it up trying to convince him otherwise. And I always appreciate her trying to, because she went down there and saw the place. You came down and slept in the house we restored.
I did.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, it was, and I love that because the whole energy of what you've been doing is about slave dwellings. But there we were able to talk about the fact that here's this house that Francis Jones' grandparents had built and originally it was a rebuilt slave dwelling that they had rebuilt and lived in, a little tiny one-room building that she built onto it in the 1950s. But you were able to, it wasn't built, what they were living in was not a building where slaves were living in, but they had been enslaved persons on the other side of that living in this building. So in a way it still was kind of that. And I loved being able to have that discussion with you there and you doing that. And it was, you know, the project didn't go as well as we had hoped because of the negative pushback. We had a lot of support. Emory Campbell, and a lot of the other folks were really, really supportive of it. But unfortunately, there was some that didn't, and they held today, and it killed the project, unfortunately. But I'd never regret us doing what we were trying to do down there, and we saved Miss Francis's house. So
Lovely. Yeah, there's always going to be some pushback somewhere, coming from somewhere. But it's up to us to continue to do what we do because we're preservationists, man. We save buildings, and in saving these buildings, sometimes we save some good memories for most, but for some they're bad memories. But these spaces need to exist nonetheless.
So how does the memories and how do you deal with the conversations regarding monuments and the concept of removal or all of that? What have those been like?
Yeah, once upon a time when this became a big thing with Mitch Landrieu in New Orleans taking away the Confederate monuments under the cover of darkness and making it more of an issue, kind of propelling this issue into the spotlight. I was of a mode back then that we need to be cautious in how we deal with this, because if we can convince the supporters of those monuments that if they just change the narrative, if they can justify keeping those monuments up there, then let's tell the whole stories of these places. Let's tell about how many people this person enslaved. Tell the story about what this person did to either hinder or assist in the pursuit of happiness of the people who didn't look like him. And if you search his DNA, are you going to find somebody in there who looks like me? So if we can incorporate all of this history in what we tell about this person who you said should stay up there, then let's incorporate all this into the narrative. Well, that didn't fly well because when we made those attempts to fiddle with the narrative, then we got all this pushback from those who wanted the narrative to stay exactly like it was. Now, what that has led us to was more monuments coming down because the compromise of telling the whole story wasn't receptive to those who were supporting the monuments that are up there. So now these monuments are coming down. So now I try to convince folks who don't think like me to think about those monuments as monuments of oppression. Now, then they kind of think about it somewhat differently when they look at them as monuments of oppression. I tell folks, and in going back to the way I started initially thinking about this, when Mitch Landrieu started doing his thing, I said, hold up, we should slow down, because where are we going to stop? Because when I look at Mount Rushmore, I see 2 slave owners, but I don't want Mount Rushmore to go away. And then if we look at Mitch Landrieu's effort and what he did in New Orleans, he took away those Confederate monuments, but he left Andrew Jackson right there in Jackson Square. And what does Andrew Jackson mean to Native Americans? You know, you're talking about the Trail of Tears. You're talking Indian removal. So why are we being selective in who we choose to put on the wrong side of history?
It's a dangerous way to play around with that.
Yes.
And to impose a belief onto everyone like that, which is exactly what happened with establishing the monuments, wasn't it?
Yes. So my point back then was, let's be a little careful. Let's try to come to this compromise. And if you can justify keeping it up there by incorporating all this other language, I've seen examples of in places where this works. You know, you go to the University of Mississippi, you can go to one of those buildings named for a former enslaver, but on a nice, beautiful sign right in front of that building is all right there. That history is there. The good, the bad, and the ugly is right there. If you go to, there's a place in Memphis where they were interpreting Nathan Bedford Forrest's business that he ran prior to becoming a member of the Confederate Cavalry. And there was something missing in that interpretation. They said nothing about that building being the buying and selling of people. Well, they took that sign off, and they just listed the business he was in. I'm good with that. They made it known on that sign now that he was in the business of buying and selling people. To me, I'm good with that.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. To help interpret that, I tell you what's fascinating is I've been to Germany several times. My wife's daughter lives in Berlin, and it is amazing. I think a good lesson for us in America how Germany deals with its past of the Holocaust and what it and how it communicates the history to its young people. And this is a perfect example. We were in Martin Luther's city where he was, and it's a beautiful medieval city with this several churches, but this beautiful church off of the square. And you go to the church and you look up. Now, Germany has had a history of really anti-Semitic throughout the Middle Ages, and they, in fact, many of these princes of these principalities, purged Jews out of their communities in the 1200s. Well, here, that's why they ended up all in Eastern Europe, because Europe pretty much pushed them out. Well, on this church built in 1200, there is on the frieze up at the top, way up at the top, on one of the corner friezes, a 3-dimensional sculpture of a pig's body, a female pig's body standing up with the head of a rabbi. And little smaller rabbi suckling from the pig, and another rabbi looking with the tail lifted up, looking up the pig from the rear, supposedly divining God's purpose, right? This is what it was meant to do. It was meant to communicate that these people were not people we want around, right? Well, after the Holocaust, the group that wanted to deal with that was not to remove it, because they thought this is important to show what people thought. And so in the below it, when you're standing looking at it, you look down and there's these old slates that are in the little square one slate has been changed to where it's lifted up, and there's a sculpture of all these brass hands trying to rise up from the ground to lift back up, to be seen. and it's a whole memorialization of that. And this is throughout all of Germany, this is happening. And I think, personally, this is something that communities need to be able to embrace, is be able to say, I think it's important to tell the story that people thought it was okay to put these monuments in the middle of squares. I think it's important that Tillman is sitting there right in front of the State House, but to be able to show the whole story of what that meant, them putting Tillman in front of the State House.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. I do TikTok now for you young minds listening. Joseph McGill 542. Yes. So what I do is I just go to places. I go to historical markers. And,
yeah, I've seen them.
And I just read it. It's not me. Lately I've been kind of, you see my face, but most of those TikToks that I put out there, I just go to the historical marker and just read it. And sometimes in some of these places I'm expressing some of the flaws that went into creating this marker, but I'm mostly highlighting the history as we interpreted our history at that time that marker was built. But I focus a lot on Black history. I'm trying to show folks how we as Americans interpret our history. And it's just as simple as going to a historic building and just reading the material on that building. You know, before I started this TikTok thing, I used to see these signs all the time. Historical marker, 1/4 mile ahead. Thought nothing of it. Now I see one of those markers, I'm stopping.
Yeah.
I'm stopping. I'm going to read that marker, and then I'm going to read it aloud, because I know that there might be sometime in the future these markers may go away, because somebody might disagree with what's on the marker. It's like the Calhoun statue that used to stand in Francis Marion Square. That marker is gone. How many people have gone up to that marker and really documented what was on that marker? That's now is lost forever.
Yeah.
In some people's memory bank, that's now gone. If you don't remember what was on there, if you didn't physically read it or document what was going on there, and that's what kind of the kind of latest evolution of my efforts. A lot of places. I was in Montgomery, Alabama, for my daughter's graduation.
Yeah.
And I went around the city, man. I seen these markers, man. I'm just reading off markers. That's kind of my thing now. That's kind of what I do. But I think it's all a part of documenting history. We live in a world now. These young folks, they want their history like quick and snippets. And if you could give them a video along the way with it, then you kind of got their attention. So
is it easier to help use that about context, the context of history, the context of everything? Is that, do you see that sensitivity to it being easier to communicate?
Yeah, well, easier to communicate in the sense that as I said, these young folks, they want to, we're you and I, we know what the microwave is all about. Microwave made our lives. It really changed our lives.
Mm-hmm.
For the younger folks, we had our Facebook for people around our age. Now this got to be quicker. You got to give it to them, and you got to give it to them quickly. If you don't, you're gonna lose them. You dealt with young folks.
Yeah.
You know how they think and some of the things they think about. So they are our future. So it's if they stop teaching the history in schools, as some are legislating that they will, then if we don't find our way to help fill that void, then we're going to be raising a bunch of little racists. We don't want that. We don't want the world to go that way. We want folks to be apprised of all the history that existed in this United States, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What the slave dwelling is about is it's an ugly part of history, but it's part of history nonetheless. Just like what we did to the natives, an ugly part of history, a part of history nonetheless. it should still be out there. We cannot thrive on just telling our citizens of these United States that in obtaining all this greatness, we committed some atrocities along the way. And we should make all these atrocities part of the history that we teach our youth. We can't just have a desire to tell them the good parts of history. Just telling them the good parts of history does not improve our relationship, does not give us that diverse community that we will be, that we are and we will continue to be. We want to continue to be able to have everybody pursue their happiness. And in that pursuit of that happiness, that means we need to understand everybody. And those are the people who don't look like us, who don't think like us. So to be a part of this great America, that's just got to be.
It's just got to be. What makes our nation amazing is we started out, and we always have been, a nation of aspiration, right? And it's about who can aspire, who has the ability to aspire and better themselves and grow. And our nation has been a story of how that has opened up, the intention of that opening up for more. And every one of those people, as they got to the place, whoever they may have been, were able to get to a foothold, go, now I can aspire to be. And that ends up fracturing the different stories. And we have to be comfortable with that. Mm-hmm. We have to be.
We do. I get along well with a lot of people like you, Mike. A lot of people who are well traveled, which means that those who very seldom stray away from where they were born, my relationship with them is not as great as a person like yourself. You left prosperity, you went into the Navy. That you grew. It's the same for me leaving King Street. It gave me that opportunity again to know that there's a world out there beyond that little world that I call King Street, South Carolina. And because I had the ability to have that experience very early on in my life, it has influenced the things that I do today. And I think that the things that I do today will have great impact on this nation, well beyond my existence here on this earth.
Well, it already has started doing that. And Joe, thank you so much for making the trip up here and sharing time. It's been a long time since we've been able to sit down and talk after National Trust and after I left Preservation, South Carolina. I miss that. Sleeping with the Ancestors. Go online, learn the stories, and talk to people in your community.
Yes.
Learn the stories that's here, and don't assume they're all self-evident. They're not.
And in the words of Rodney King, can't we all just get along?
And with that, let's also remember place, purpose, preservation. Take care.